Thank you. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know it's early in the morning, and some of us are also jet lagged, so I very much appreciate it. So we're going to talk a little bit about restaking security. I think, obviously, as these networks are going live, there's tons of capital in them. It becomes more paramount to think about what A, a security model is, B, what threat models are, and C, how to model them. I think in this talk, I'm going to sort of be more high level, but almost all of the results you see or are mentioned are in papers online, and you can find me to find them. So we're going to kind of talk about three things to understand restaking. First, we're going to kind of define restaking in a sort of more combinatorial and algorithmic game theory sense as a matching market. Then we're going to talk about different threat models, how those threat models affect how you should assess risk in these systems. And third, we'll talk about what the notion of the minimum amount of security is that needs to be in these networks. So first, we'll talk about matching markets. So restaking networks are effectively matching markets between validators who are already operating Ethereum, for instance, or Solana in the Jito case, and services. Services are extra new protocol extensions such as rollups, oracles, et cetera, that are trying to utilize the security of these from these validators. In classical matching markets, this is sort of one where you're looking at sort of dating preferences, and you can kind of see, hey, the set of edges represents the set of all possible viable matches. In the thing on the left, there's a feasible maximal matching. In the right, there's a contention. So matching markets are sort of everywhere. I think people won the Nobel Prize for them. But the main difference about matching markets and sort of things like auctions that you see in MEV are you generally have inhomogeneous goods that have some shared property on the supply side. So this in the case of AVSs is validators. So some validators might be running beefy hardware, can run your extra service that needs a bunch of GPUs. Some validators are running on a Raspberry Pi. They can't run all AVSs. So there's some sense in which all of them share the fact that they're running Ethereum consensus, but they all have slightly different properties. A natural place where you see matching markets outside of these types of settings is kidney exchange. And in kidney exchange, you have this notion of supply, like everyone has kidneys, a lot of people can donate them. But there's all these constraints, blood type, size, kind of how old the kidney is, whether it's had dialysis, et cetera, right? So you can kind of think of each validator as a different kidney in this case. I'm sure those with Raspberry Pis are the ones with the worst kidneys, unfortunately. On the demand side, you have services, so that's oracles, coprocessors, GPU networks, et cetera, that are sort of demanding being operated. So one important thing to understand about matching markets versus auctions, you might say, hey, couldn't the validators just run an auction and say, OK, like you service Oracle, like you have to bid for us to run your Oracle light client or side client. One important thing is auctions focus on generally maximizing revenue or maximizing welfare for the buyer and the seller. Matching markets are focused on stability, which basically means when I match validators to services, there should be no one who's unhappy in the sense that they would rather have switched and been matched with someone else. And in crypto, we've seen, especially over the last 2 years, the microstructure move from a lot of auctions, so MEV auctions, parachain auctions, things like that, to much more matching-like things like intents and restaking. The natural way to represent matching markets is, of course, via graphs. And the idea is you have a bipartite graph that represents the supply side and the demand side. Those are the two portions of bipartition, where one side is the supply, so the validators, and one side is the demand, the services. One important thing to note is that in most matching markets that are studied outside of crypto, this graph is static, so it doesn't change. So the set of people who could donate a kidney is not changing. And there's usually a central planner. So the central planner chooses the matching. But in decentralized matching markets like restaking, that's just not true. OK, so the the first claim I made is restaking is a decentralized matching market. So when we want to analyze the security of matching markets, they're a lot harder to analyze than sort of the classical ones that we know of. One of the reasons is A, permissionless means you can be matched and unmatched at will. B, without a central planner, the only way to construct matches is by correct incentives. And C, you have to actually have an explicit adversarial model. So we'll see some examples of this, but for instance, if I ask you the following question, Ethereum has $1 billion of stake, let's say, hypothetically. What amount of economic security does it actually have, right? You would actually have a hard time answering that. If you said it has 333 million for double spends, that's a valid answer. But that's not really the notion of economic security for these other services. So for an Oracle manipulation might actually cost less because I only have to bid in block building auctions for a certain number of time. And so there's sort of some notion in which the types of attacks you're modeling can define what it means to have a certain dollar amount of economic security. And as you can see, no one on the internet agrees. So maybe we'll take a tiny detour to try to talk about what the notion of economic security is. I think you can exercise left to the reader to go find all the million tweets about people fighting and being inconsistent. So as I said earlier, what does it mean to have $333 million of economic security? So there's sort of a sense in which this nebulous concept of economic security in an absolute sense is very hard to define. You have to choose what asset you're measuring in. You have to enumerate the attack space. Double spends are not necessarily the only attack anyone cares about in 2024. You have to consider competitive pressures for stake. Why would I lock up my capital if I can get yield elsewhere that's higher? And you also have to think about how much the opportunity cost for capital is of doing an attack, and also how long it takes to execute an attack. But generally, the kind of attack cost is linear in the amount of stake somehow. So you're writing this in formulas. We kind of say the cost of attack is lower bounded by a price, P of T, times the amount of stake, times some notion of compounding or opportunity cost based on how long it takes to execute an attack, times some notion of a minimum threshold of stake needed to execute the attack. So this is sort of just a generic way of saying this is what a lower bound on economic security is within POS for different attacks. What does that look like for restaking? Well, restaking actually has two sort of competing pressures when you try to quantify what its economic security is. The first is participants purchase stake to capture excess yield. So if more people are buying Ethereum to restake, they're actually causing the economic security in dollar terms to go up. So in some sense, you can argue that restaking can improve if a lot of new participants are purchasing. On the other hand, if people get slashed, that reduces the overall network security, right? Because I've basically burnt a bunch of stake that was locked, and now effectively the total amount that can be slashed in the worst case event has gone down. So how would we represent this? It's not so different from the last formula. We have a notion of a stake, that's the capital sigma. We have a notion of a price in numerator terms. We have a notion of how much people increase the value, which is this 1 plus delta term. And then we have a notion of a risk measure, which is how much stake is burnt, what percentage of the stake should I expect in an average case or worst case scenario is slashed. And then I have a notion of a price impact function. So what this is if there is demand for delta times the stake that is there, how much does that actually push the price up and then cause the actual cost of attack to go up? So if we zoom out, one of the reasons for trying to formalize this is you're really trying to measure some notion of cost of attack. Oops, I guess that one was there. So one question is, when is restaking safe? And so one very simple definition is the cost of attack when restaking is present is always higher than the cost without restaking, and that's what this inequality is. If we write that out, we get this formula. And if we write this out, we get a formula that says the risk, the maximum amount of stake that can be slashed has to be as a percentage, so this is from 0 to 1, has to satisfy this type of formula. G is a value greater than 1. And so one important thing to note is that this has this dependence of like the risk, the slashing risk, on the actual price impact of people participating in restaking, which is not great, right? Because from a, say, formal verification standpoint or from a fuzzing standpoint, I can't really check this condition. I can't make this a valid condition that needs to be met. So the natural question is, can we model this without needing the price or staking dynamics? Can we kind of have a static model for what it means for restaking to be secure, and then you can construct formal conditions that you could verify? So to do that, we will have to do some math. So the main object of study within these systems is what is called a restaking graph. A restaking graph consists of 5 components. First is the set of node operators. So these are the validators who are operating the network. That's the set V. Second is the stake. So for each operator, you can think of it as a vertex label for each operator of how much stake they have. Third is the services. So this is the AVSs. So this is your Oracle, this is your coprocessor, this is your DA layer, et cetera. Third is a notion of the maximum profit from corrupting a service. So in this model, you sort of assume there's sort of a maximum honeypot prize that if you were able to corrupt the service, you get to get this amount of reward. So that's what pi is. The fifth component is a corruption threshold. So in, say, a BFT protocol, it might be 1/3, which is the sort of double spend in proof of stake. In a longest chain protocol, it might be 1/2, which is the sort of attack a longest chain protocol. And one important difference between restaking and normal staking, which is extremely crucial to the security model, is that I can use the same stake to validate multiple services. So this node operator, V intersection, is actually operating both services, S1 and S2, with the same stake. So they're putting up 100 ETH, they're validating both of those services. If they get slashed by either one of the services, it's as if they got slashed on both services. That's a crucial point that you have to keep in mind when thinking about this. OK. So now, you might say, hey, is this graph real? Like, are you bullshitting me and like you just wanted to do some math for fun? This is the eigenlayer restaking graph over time. Green are edges being added. The right side is the services. The left side is the operators. Or sorry, am I getting it backwards? Yeah, left side is the operators. Sorry, right side is the services. But you can see that this graph is changing as people are adjusting incentives over time. And that, as you saw earlier, affects the security of this system. So how do we formalize, in a sort of formal verification sense, what an attack means? So there are 2 conditions. First is profitability. Profitability is give me a subset A of services, and give me a subset B of validators who are colluding to attack that set of services, and you need the profit to be greater than the slashing penalty. So what this means is the maximum profit I can extract from attacking those services is greater than the amount of stake I lose, right? So that's a positive profit attack. The second thing is feasibility. So what this says is for every service I'm attacking, this cartel, this set of validators, has at least the minimum amount of stake needed. So for instance, if one service is a BFT protocol, the attacking services have at least 1/3 of the stake. In symbols, this is what this looks like, given the variables we saw earlier. On the left-hand side, you see the total profit from attacking the set is greater than the total stake. On the left side, you see the stake held by the cartel at each service is greater than the threshold. So the first place was defined, Appendix B of the Eigenlayer white paper. The second place where it's cleaned up and formalized, which a lot of the results that follow are Durvisville and Roughgarden, this paper from this year. OK. Note that these are properties you can validate of a live restaking system, right? Because a live restaking system is defined by this graph. This graph is public. All of the data here is registered on Ethereum. If you go look at the EigenPod contract, you can get all of these numbers on every block. Now, what does an attack look like? So in this graph, each individual service is actually over-collateralized. So service 1, the maximum profit you can get is 4, but there's 6 stake. So if all the stake is slashed, you have at best a -2 profit. And the same for service 2. But if everyone colludes to attack both services simultaneously, it is a positive profit because I can get 8 units of profit and I only have to expend 7 units of stake. And the real reason for this is because the middle node operator is sharing their stake. So by slashing them once, you've slashed them everywhere. So this naturally leads to what's known as a cascading attack. So a cascading attack on a restaking network is, imagine that some fraction of stake is lost. Maybe that's an operator that got DDoSed and is down. Maybe that is an operator who was malicious and sent an invalid block and got slashed. For some reason, their stake has disappeared. Once they've disappeared, what they do is they create a profitable attack. So in this case, the middle operator can attack the first service once the first operator is gone. And once that attack occurs, they've opened up an attack for the second service to be attacked by the last operator. So what this shows is that you can have these sequences of profitable and feasible attacks until you continue to lose stake. And in this case, you've lost 100% of stake. So this says R in the formula we had earlier is 1, which is bad, because that means the restaking network has slashed all the stake of the underlying L1, which is obviously the worst case. This is the proof of stake version of a lending liquidation cascade. So how do we formalize this? So we define a valid attack sequence as a sequence of pairs of sets of services and sets of operators such that each attack, AI, BI, is profitable under the definition we had and feasible. And we define a quantity, R psi of G, which is very similar to the R earlier we talked about, which is like the percentage of stake that is burnt expected, as the worst case percentage given an attack if I lose psi stake. So imagine the network has a shock and it loses psi stake. Psi could be, say, 10%. Then this says what percentage is the longest cascade attack going to lose. In symbols, it's written like this, just so you can see it's between 0 and 1, so there's no hiding anything there. OK. So this actually helps us answer this question. How much stake do we actually need? How much economic security does our single AVS actually need to be secure? We choose an R psi threshold that we're happy with. So hey, we're willing to tolerate a shock of 10% at most. And if R psi is only 5% given a 10% shock, then we're willing to tolerate that. It lets you have some bounds on how much the worst case attack is. So are we done? Not exactly. So this paper shows that there exists an infinite family of graphs with n validators where the entire graph is slashed, which is very bad. It's actually nice to see in pictures. So in pictures, each of these dots is a validator. Each of the boxes is a service. So we have 6 services. We have the red L-shaped services. So there's 4 of those, each with 3 validators each. We have the blue box services, which have 6 validators. And what you see is first operator is taken out. You move to the right. And then when you go down a row, you see that that opens up an attack against the first service, which opens up attack against the bottom row, which opens up an attack against the other services, and then all the stake is gone. And because this is a tiling, there's an infinite number of them. So the same paper showed sort of maybe a blessing in disguise, which is if you're actually over-collateralized, then you can actually bound this amount of stake you lose. Great, we might be done. However, and sort of you can think of this as like the proof of stake analog of a decentralized stablecoin needs to be over-collateralized to avoid cascading depegs. The problem is this over-collateralization condition, which we won't exactly define, is actually really strong. So it actually says if I have a bunch of services, I may have to have as much stake as the sum of all of the profits over all services. In translation, imagine you have a restaking network that only has 2 services, where one service you can attack and get at most 1 ETH of profit. The other service you can attack and you get 1,000,000 ETH of profit. Under this over-collateralization condition, you need 1,000,001 ETH for the 1 ETH of attack service to be safe, which is obviously ludicrous. At that point, I would just start my own POS network, right? Why would I pay for 1 million ETH to secure 1 ETH of attack profit? So is this a dead end? Of course, I'm giving this talk, so the answer is no. So one thing that this whole model doesn't consider is the incentives, like how much are people being paid, and how do we include that when we think about profitability for an attack? So if we think about how restaking went from 0 to 15 billion, it came out of people paying incentives. It wasn't sort of like a free lunch that people were running validators. And so we actually have to think about each service offering an incentive, either a token incentive or points. So we add one term here, which is this term R, which sort of represents how much each service is paying. And in response to the rewards, we assume the validators aren't sitting ducks. They can adjust where they place their stake. And what this means is validators, after a slashing event in this model, can rebalance. And they can, in some ways, halt these cascades by pure economic incentive, where someone gets slashed. If it was profitable for them, it is profitable for me to join. And so I will join and prevent the cascade, which is what this yellow box is, which is basically after a slashing event, someone from the top row joins the bottom row, prevents cascades. So in this model, we assume the adversary is somewhat weaker in that the adversary has liquidity and cost of attack constraints. And then we assume the node operators are smarter. They can adjust in response to these incentives. And what you show is that basically the maximum cascade length actually decreases as the number of services gets large, and that you can compute this efficiently. So basically what this says is, if you have enough rewards, you can actually, and node operators are not idiots, you basically can reduce this cascade risk that we saw earlier. Again, adversaries face costs, node operators are smarter, AVSs pay rewards, you don't have as many of these attacks. So how do we reduce this in practice? So you might say, hey, EigenLayer's live, like how do they actually do this? So they actually proposed a new mechanism called unique stake, which is a notion that every service can say, some fraction of the stake allocated to me is only slashable by me, by my service. Like no one else can slash it. So in all of the cascades you saw, the reason they were bad risks was another service could slash stake delegated to my service, and then I lost economic security. The point of unique stake is I'm able to say, actually, some portion of the stake is only slashable by me. And so each service is able to reserve a percentage of stake, which caps the maximum overlap between services of how much stake is shared. And so it's sort of a trade-off between capital efficiency of these systems versus security. And the key thing is, when you have this unique stake, you can actually provide very efficiently verifiable guarantees even before the network is live, some sort of like formal verification guarantees of taking all these constraints I've talked about earlier and verifying them ahead of time. And you sort of have this verifiable collateral requirement. And with that, I think that's it.